Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, Stephanie Desmon talks to Johns Hopkins researcher Albert Garcia-Romeu about magic mushrooms and psilocybin. Psilocybin is the compound that makes them so magic. They discuss the history, what researchers are learning today about its therapeutic use in clinical trials for patients with a laundry list of health concerns, and why he worries some states where voters have legalized it may be getting ahead of the science. Let's listen.
Albert Garcia-Romeu, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So today I want to talk to you about magic mushrooms, about research into psychedelic drugs like psilocybin. And I know that this is a long history in our United States and around the world, the use of magic mushrooms, as many people call them familiarly. But talk to me about sort of why they fell out of favor as a research tool and where things are going.
Yeah, and as you said, there's a long history of use. Indigenous cultures have used these, going back hundreds or thousands of years. And then really it wasn't until the mid-1950s that they were discovered by Western science. And at the time, there was already quite a bit of buzz around psychedelics, particularly LSD, which was a topic of interest in psychiatry and neurosciences. However, as that research progressed, there was also a parallel track of countercultural use, recreational use of these psychedelics outside of laboratory settings, of course. And that really brought a big backlash from Nixon administration, politicians in general, seeing this as a public health risk, seeing this as a problem that they wanted to somehow figure out how to eradicate. And so that led to the Controlled Substances Act in 1970 and 71 here in the U.S. that then put cannabis as well as all the psychedelics in the Schedule I, the most restricted class of drugs. And so as a result of both that legal move, but also the general climate of the time, which really, at a wide level had started to demonize these drugs as really dangerous, that led to quite a bit of stigma and taboo around them, at least through the 70s and 80s. And then we didn't really see much work happening until closer to the end of the 90s.
And the kind of work that's being done at Johns Hopkins or at other places is focusing on what?
Well, there's been a variety of different types of research. There's preclinical research looking at animals and cellular molecular models of what's going on, at the very small systems levels of the cell and the neuron, receptor. But what our work at Johns Hopkins is really focused on is the human behavioral pharmacology of psilocybin, meaning, what happens when we give people these drugs? What are the appropriate dose ranges to give it to them safely and to create particular profile of subjective effects? And after that work was really through, it was moving now into more clinical related research, meaning, how do we use these as tools for mental health care, whether that be as an intervention for something like major depression or for a substance use disorder. And then that led to other types of mechanistic research, specifically looking at the brain-related impacts of these drugs. What's the neuroimaging data look like? What's going on at the level of the whole brain or the brain networks that are interacting to create these really peculiar effects that we see in people?
Mm-hmm. What are some of those effects?
Well, these drugs are often called hallucinogenic or psychedelic. I don't love the term hallucinogen because it often invokes this idea that people are going to be seeing hallucinations, things that aren't really there, and that perhaps they may not have that insight that what they're seeing is not real. And that's very rarely the case under the influence of these drugs. It's much more, I do like the term psychedelic seeming to be more appropriate because really the thrust of that is that it helps to reveal what's in the mind. And often that tends to be things that we might shy away from or things that we might not want to think about. But as a result, they can be very useful in psychedelic therapies, specifically for addressing problems like mood, anxiety, and addictions. But when people are having these experiences, they're often having both profound perceptual changes. So things like their vision, hearing, and other senses like sense of touch can be amplified. There can be both disturbances or distortions in what they're looking at. So things like the wall or the floor might look like they're moving. And so that's kind of like a hallmark feature. And you go back to the psychedelic artwork of the 1960s and you see, the paisley and the tie-dye. And, that really is kind of playing off of some of those perceptual changes. But, we think of those as more surface level effects of the drug. And when you dive a little bit deeper, you really start to have also some cognitive changes in the way that people are thinking, some emotional changes in terms of the way that they're feeling and experiencing their emotions. And by allowing people to really break out of their normal rigid patterns of thinking and being aware of their emotions, it does allow people to come to a different perspective on themselves, on their way of life. And certainly in these therapeutic studies, what that looks like is potentially having a new insight or a new way of looking at, some of the problematic behaviors or issues that they've been dealing with. And from an emotional standpoint, it can really allow people to have important breakthroughs, including things like a cathartic moment where they may, grieve for somebody that they've lost that they never felt like they were able to do, or just having a very strong sense of love and connection to just the universe overall, and feeling like that can be very healing and therapeutic for them. And that can also help them shift their priorities and values afterwards. So, these are some of the types of experiences we often see when we're using specifically high dose psilocybin.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for this. And I sort of want to make it clear that you're not just giving people psilocybin. I mean, people who go to raves, don't get cured of their depression. So what is it that's sort of special about this that makes it safer and more therapeutic?
Yeah, we have a full process that we engage in when we're doing this as a sort of therapeutic endeavor. And what that includes is 4 phases, as I like to see it. We always have an initial screening process where we're looking at a person top to bottom, both from a physical health standpoint, but also a mental health standpoint. So that includes doing basic blood work, getting an EKG to assess cardiovascular function, and having a full physical exam. Then we also get into the nuts and bolts of their mental health and their mental health history. Have they struggled with depression for a long time? Have they had symptoms of psychotic illness? Have they had any sort of bipolar mood manifestations? Has that happened in any of their close family members? All of these things are taken into account just to make sure that we know it's safe for them to go through with this process. And if we think there's a potential risk there, we'll often screen these individuals out of the study so that they don't go through the actual therapeutic process. However, if people seem to be fit for the study and we think that they're a good bet that this will be safe for them, we're able to then enter the next phase, which would be preparation. That's usually 1 month roughly in weekly counseling meetings where we would be chatting with these individuals. We'd be working with them. There's typically a therapeutic dyad, meaning a couple of therapists or facilitators who are going to be working with them throughout the full process, from the beginning to the drug dosing to the end. And really, this is partially getting to know you, making sure that we understand the person's life history, formative events, and worldview, but also learning more about what's going on with them related to their presenting problems. So if they're dealing with a depression or a substance use issue, what does that look like in real life? And what would they like to see happen or come about as a result of the therapeutic process? So we're really learning about their issues and then trying to set some therapeutic goals in that process. And then we're also preparing them, and we're going to tell them this is what you may encounter during your drug experience. This is what it could look like. And if you're going to have a difficult experience, this is how you navigate that. So we want to kind of go into all of that before we actually get to the drug dosing sessions. We do the drug dosing sessions here on site at our lab at the Bayview campus. And those typically take a full 8-hour workday. People come in the morning, we do preliminaries, and once we get started, they take the pill and they're feeling the drug effects for roughly 6 to 7 hours. And during that time, we're very non-directive. We let them lay on a couch. We have music playing. We ask them to cover their eyes with some eye shades and really to go inside and to have an inward focused experience. We don't do a lot of direction during that process, but if people start to get frightened or anxious, then we're able to help intervene in those cases. And then afterwards, the kind of final part of this whole process is what we call integration. And that's an aftercare period where we talk about the drug sessions. We try to make meaning from the experience, see if there's any valuable takeaways for them, and figure out how to make that something that's lasting so that it's not just a temporary aha moment that they may have on one day, but that it can lead to ongoing changes that are benefits for them, a month or a year or later down the line.
The field has had great success with this, at least in trials, in addiction, with treating depression for people with terminal illnesses, et cetera. I guess the question is, are you also determining here if it's safe? And because, for example, all I think about is, make sure I guess you're trying to make sure that no one gets too close to the window, right? Because this is a kind of drug that could make you want to jump out the window, for example. I mean, are those things that are, obviously that's controlled where you are?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're in a safe setting. We're with trained facilitators. We always have medical staff on call during these sessions in case there is an emergency. But I can tell you in over 700 dosing sessions here, the number of times we had to call a doctor into the room have been under 10. I mean, it's very rare. And that's because of all the intensive screening that we do. Now, in terms of are we assessing safety, we're always keeping track of that with, throughout all of these studies. But these drugs are remarkably physiologically safe. You could take a very large amount of psilocybin, for instance, and not have any sort of fatal overdose, as opposed to something like alcohol, opioids, or benzodiazepines, which are out there and readily available. So they're very physiologically safe, but psychologically, they can be unpredictable in terms of how people will respond to them. So that's why we take care to keep track of that. But, if we felt like it was physically unsafe for people, there would be very little likelihood that we'd be able to do this at all. So, again, these are safe compounds, and we know that from a long history of both indigenous use as well as recreational use and now clinical research.
I read that in Colorado and Oregon, voters have passed measures to legalize psilocybin. That's obviously not going to be controlled settings, right?
That's not, well, it sort of depends. So, there's a fine line between what we would think of as medicalization, where there's a medical approval for use, legalization, where it's just you can go buy it on the corner, at the corner store if you want, or decriminalization, which is this is still black market substance, but if the police catch you, they're not supposed to do much about it. And so, the laws are different between some of the different places. But in particular, in Oregon, they'd already decriminalized these substances and actually all drugs, not just psychedelics, meaning if police catch you with these drugs, they're not supposed to bother you. But Oregon has made the further step of allowing for some sort of therapeutic use that would be in a controlled setting. So that's kind of the next step towards that medicalization.
Is there any concern that will sort of take on a life of its own? I mean, I know that I've read people are singing the praises of microdosing with these medications. And, are these safe? Are we giving them a stamp of approval maybe before they're ready?
Let's see. Well, I'll just say briefly on the microdosing front specifically, the data are not there to support any sort of therapeutic benefit. And so that is always something that I like to highlight for people because there's a lot of anecdotes there, but there's not a lot of good controlled data showing therapeutic benefits. Now, in terms of using these high dose treatments, which is what we typically do here, those seem to work really well. And we've seen that, in multiple randomized trials helping people with depression, anxiety, substance use disorders. So there's definitely evidence for that having serious therapeutic potential. Now, are we getting ahead of ourselves in places like Oregon where they're trying to roll out therapeutic use? I would say probably. And the main concern there is that the level of training and regulation that needs to go along with this type of treatment, I don't think has been well codified. And I don't think it's been well thought out to the point where this is something that lots of people are able to do well at this point. I've had years of training working here at Hopkins to do this. And, and I'm still learning things. And I think that the way that things are looking in certain areas, they're going to have potentially medical professionals, potentially people who are therapists trying to do this work, but also other people who may not have that level of training. And then they may be getting very little in the way of education about how to use these safely or what to do if things go wrong. And so that's the concern, that there could be some collateral damage there in some of these places.
So looking into the future, what do you see happening with psilocybin in the next 5 years? Do you think it'll be FDA approved for certain psychiatric disorders? What else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think right now there's a movement towards that FDA approval status, specifically to see psilocybin approved as a treatment for major depression. And so the likelihood is that in the next 5 years, that's going to happen. I know that the research is underway now to try to get it through that approval process. And so far, all the data that have been published to date have been quite positive on that front. But beyond that, there's going to be a lot more research, both on psilocybin, but a lot of other psychedelics that are out there. And that includes drugs like LSD, substances like MDMA that are, getting close to a medical approval already as well, actually closer than psilocybin, and, a whole host of other compounds and conditions. And, that's what we're really seeing now, even here at Hopkins, where we have studies ongoing of psilocybin for anorexia, psilocybin for obsessive compulsive disorder, psilocybin for chronic Lyme disease, psilocybin for mild cognitive impairment. And so, the field is kind of exploding both outwardly to look at new conditions and also inwardly to understand the mechanisms better. Because as we see more of these therapeutic benefits, then that raises the question, how are these happening and how are they maintaining for so long, even when the drug dosing might just happen on one or a few days?
And I also want to remind people, not to, if someone hands you mushrooms and tell you they're magic, be careful.
Well, that's the problem, right? Yeah, when you're getting something on the black market, then you really have a hard time knowing what it is that you're getting, what the content of that is. So that, causes its own set of risks.
Well, Albert Garcia-Romeu, this has been very interesting. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmon. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.